Hello, I'm Johanna Walker from the University of Southampton, and I'm presenting the paper I co-authored with Gefion Thuermer and Elena Simperl of King's College London and Carr, also from the University of Southampton. Our paper is called Smart Rural, the Open Data Gap, and we explore whether there is an urban-rural divide in the availability and use of open data. Our starting point for this research, ironically, was in fact smart cities. Smart cities and open data have become very entwined. In fact, smart cities are a driver for all kinds of data. This focus on cities makes great sense. They have dense populations which can be reached comparatively easily. That same density creates a vast amount of data, and infrastructural changes via use of that data in smaller geographical areas can have substantial impact. Our research focuses mainly on European countries. In many of these countries, such as Spain, Cyprus, Malta, and the United Kingdom, reaching the urban population effectively means reaching 50% of the entire population. But what do smart cities imply for the 27% of EU citizens who live in rural or non-urban areas? While many densely populated EU member states have a very high proportion of citizens living in urban areas, the opposite is true in most Central and Eastern European countries. Over half of Lithuanians, nearly half of Slovenians, Hungarians and Croatians live in rural areas. But even in more Western states such as Ireland or France, over a third of citizens live in rural areas. There are challenges in merely transposing urban practices to a rural setting. Some of the key areas of smart city investment, such as those to do with traffic and parking management and multimodal transport, are far less applicable in rural settings. In comparison to their urban or suburban counterparts, rural populations tend to experience negative gaps in education, income, device availability, and mobile and broadband access. Health challenges also differ for rural versus urban populations. For instance, urban populations frequently suffer from extensive waiting times for healthcare, to access healthcare, resulting in a focus on speeding up diagnostic processes, while rural populations are often deterred from seeking treatments due to the distances and resulting necessity to travel involved, which may require altogether different solutions. Further, according to the Rural Open Data Project, few, if any, rural local governments provide open data, and little is known about how open data affects rural communities. If there is a benefit to communities from open data policies, it is likely that rural communities are benefiting less than urban ones, if at all. So effectively, this is the urban-rural divide that we have heard of in other contexts, but the existing research suggested it was likely to be present in open data as well. Our previous research had also suggested that various dimensions of data that are more prized, such as volume, were less likely to be available in the rural population context. Managing small data sets also meant that aspects such as granularity were likely to be reduced. For instance, data from multiple Scottish islands being compiled as a single data set, making it hard to find the data for a single island. Finally, we noticed that the research on improving digital offering for rural areas often neglected data, focusing instead on broadband division and rural digital hubs, but not the benefits of data provision or access. So these, to sum up, were our incentives for focusing on this as an area of research. The focus on smart cities that we felt was really dominating the conversation. The lack of rural policy, specifically data recommendations within rural policy reports. Previous research that had led us to thinking of rural data as something that could be quantitatively and qualitatively understood as very different from urban data. And of course, the urban-rural digital divide, understanding that for other digital contexts and wondering what it meant for data. In order to focus the research, we needed to define our topic of interest. Rural is a surprisingly hard concept to define, as it is often described as non-urban, i.e. by what it is not, rather than by what it is. In the EU, a degree of urbanisation, de Gerber classification, was created in 2014. This classification distinguishes three types of areas: densely and thinly and intermediately populated areas. This new approach was developed to harmonise several similar but not identical spatial concepts and is based on the population grid. However, population is only one way to define rural. Others include levels of built-on surfaces and intensity of light at night. Even having decided where we should look gives us a geographical focus for rural, but doesn't necessarily clarify what we should look at within that area. So we took an old school approach and consulted a dictionary. This suggested that rural is really about two things: people living in the countryside and the industries and activities of the countryside, which we are calling the rural economy. We don't include all rural economic activities, but focus on those that pertain to the land, or indeed the sea, and which are not possible on the same scale, or at all, in urban areas. The most important of these is agriculture, which covers 47% of the EU territory and represents around 40% of the EU budget. Forestry accounts for 1% of the total EU GDP and is also important culturally. And fishing is the final area we look at, which also claims a substantial budget share and has important environmental repercussions. So now we come on to the issues affecting rural population data availability. And our research had both a quantitative and qualitative element. Our qualitative research consisted of interviewing experts in the area of both rural open data and open data from largely rural countries. We identified 5 factors that affected the availability of rural population data: the level of digitisation, awareness of open data, IT capacity, usefulness of open data, and standardisation. The level of digitisation is simply that. Many rural administrations are working with analogue tools. Datasets may still be collected on paper and at best published as PDFs. Even in more urban countries, this may be true. In previous research, when looking for open data on caravan parks, which are largely, if not exclusively, found in non-urban areas as primary residences in the UK, we found that most of the data was available as PDFs. Moving on to IT capacity, our interviewees in both Southern and Northern Europe reported that some local authorities had no IT department of any kind, and so had no capacity to manage data. Initiatives included piggybacking on the IT of larger or nearby urban authorities, and in some cases simply getting lucky with motivated employees. There is much less institutionalisation of open data culture or practices. Awareness of open data varies, both amongst publishers and potential users. More urban member states tend to have a higher awareness of open data. Standardisation becomes an issue where a country is very large and has a number of rural local authorities. In situations such as Romania, where central government receives data from 3,000 local authorities in a variety of formats, it is a huge undertaking to standardise the data for publication. Finally, usefulness has several dimensions. Given the challenges above, data is not necessarily open because it is perceived to be the most useful. It is often done on a low-hanging fruit basis. This implies specifically rural datasets may be the last to be published because of the issues outlined above. Other publication practices that affect availability are generally structured around datasets being considered too small to be useful and therefore compiled or not published. Rural County Roscommon in Ireland, with 64,500 residents, is extremely unusual and is something of a beacon project in terms of the sheer volume of data it has published as a rural area. It has the second largest open data output in Ireland. Roscommon published 124 datasets on the European Data Portal, covering areas such as the Graveyard Survey, council planning applications, and the Thatched Building Survey. This dataset is very small, with only 37 line items. It is available in 6 formats. It is unlikely that a complete set of thatched building surveys from all Irish councils can be compiled. However, as a record on its own merits, it has value. For instance, citizens may use it on which to base their own informal survey for hyperlocal purposes. Roscommon has used their own open data to provide services for residents and tourists, and the winter service gritting plan had received 2,514 views to last October. So we might hypothesise that rural member states could be at an earlier stage of open data. Some of the issues we've just outlined are going to sound familiar to anyone who has worked in open data. The publication of low-hanging fruit datasets, institutionalising practices and raising awareness are issues that are present in the emerging stages of open data culture. Is there, and therefore, any actual true rural open data effect? Or is it simply that the more rural states are at an earlier stage of open data maturity? So we hypothesise that more rural states should mean lower open data maturity. Using the Eurostat data, which ranks member states by the rurality, and the European Data Portal Open Data Maturity rankings, we found no correlation. So we believe this is not affected by open data maturity in more rural countries, and that what we are looking at is a genuine issue. We'll now move on from what we're terming rural population open data and look at rural economy open data. The catalogue that we used to try and have understanding about the availability of agriculture, fisheries and forestry datasets, which we've called Agriculture for Convenience, was that of the European Data Portal catalogue, which harvests the metadata from the national portals of all EU member states and some other occasional city and individual interest vertical dataset portals. So agriculture is the largest category on the European data portal, but it's highly concentrated. Germany, Poland and France provide over 90% of the datasets. Poland has more than doubled their datasets on EDP since our original research. In September 2019, they added 37,000 datasets, of which 30,000 are in the agricultural category, making them the new largest contributor, ahead of Germany. Other countries with a high proportion of agriculture in their GDP, such as Serbia, 6.2%, Romania, 4.3%, Greece and Bulgaria, both on 3.7% each, make little to no agricultural datasets, or indeed datasets in general, available. Most remarkably, the Czech Republic, where agriculture is 2% of their GDP, shares 34% of all the datasets in the EDP, but less than 1% of the agricultural data. So this slide here shows the numbers as of 2019. There have been some changes in the actual total numbers, as just mentioned, but the relationship is still the same. So I'm just going to go over some of those changes because I think it illustrates how the agricultural datasets are and are not related to overall dataset sharing, openness. So Austria, for instance, increased its number of datasets on the EDP by 805%, over 25,000 datasets, but only 19 of those were agricultural datasets. Sweden uploaded a further 5,000 datasets, of which 116 were agricultural, and Ireland 8,683 datasets, which is up 605%, and of that, 114 of them were agricultural. Poland had, as mentioned, the largest agricultural edition. They added nearly 15,000 datasets, which in fact is only up 47% for them, but 12,000 of them were agricultural. Germany, interestingly, added 4,288 datasets over this period, but lost 1,410 agricultural datasets. So this was they did at the same time add one agricultural use case, the use case catalogue, but in terms of the data, they have now appear to have less agricultural data than before. And of course, one of the areas that we're exploring is why that is. France had the largest total edition of 55,000 datasets, of which only 578 were agricultural. And the Czech Republic added, as previously mentioned, had very, very few datasets, but had the largest overall number of datasets, has added another 50,000, but only 33 more agricultural datasets. And so the ratio of agriculture to overall data is still abysmal. They have over 300,000 datasets in general on the site, and very, very few are about agriculture. So it's difficult to draw conclusions from these basic insights, as the numbers alone do not say much about the context. It may be that these countries do not collect data in a systematic fashion, and consequently it's not harvested by the EDP. It's also possible that these countries, despite being agriculture intensive, lack awareness of the value about this. The key finding is the inconsistency between the relative value of agricultural data to these countries, or the potential relative value, and the availability of data sets, and also the inconsistency across member states in general. So data provision does seem strongly opportunistic, not strategic. Although there's no discernible pattern in the relationship between proportion of GDP and agricultural data shared, this does raise a number of crucial questions. Why are so comparatively few member states sharing agricultural data? Are Germany, France and Poland simply opening agricultural data sets because they are easily accessible? Or should other member states be opening agricultural data at the same levels? How valuable are the agricultural data sets? Or do they have a very long tail? We need to look for other data sources to draw conclusions and also to understand some of the context, which we explored qualitatively. Qualitatively, many of the issues we found in rural population data certainly still apply to rural economy data regarding capacity, digitalisation and low-hanging fruit. However, we also discovered further issues. These included those to do with publication. Datasets might be published on the Ministry of Agriculture site or Forestry site, but not on the national portal. That this potentially affects its ability to be found could be shown by the fact this data isn't picked up by the European Data Portal. Data might be nominally open, but only available on request, which requires knowing that it exists in order to request it, and there may be a lack of reusable formats. In fishing specifically, we found that data hoarding, unclear licensing, and a lack of incentive still prevail. On the other hand, some of the most advanced data portals are found in forestry. The drivers of rural open data are quite often urban. They're not rurally driven. As one respondent said, there are few fishermen sitting in a boat thinking of a way to use open data. Thus, there is a gap between the rural industries and the audience that might benefit from the use of open data and those who are working with open data. However, an audience that is both located rurally and creates and consumes a vast amount of data is farmers. In many cases, patterns that might affect livestock or crops, particularly to do with disease in both, cannot be seen in the data of one farm, but can be easily spotted by combining data from multiple farms. In this case, it may even make sense for farmers to crowdsource the data themselves. While there may be some commercial sensitivity in the data, there are also strong arguments for publishing openly. For instance, it may help government departments in identifying and combating the spread of disease and planning prevention. In our paper, we focus on our research on the availability and use of rural data, but there are also some policy insights that arose, and I'd like to conclude with those. The key policy insight for us was that of the potential value of the smart region. We prefer this understanding that a city is not independent of its surroundings, especially in terms of transport, supply chains, food security, etc., while acknowledging rural areas benefit from metropolitan skills and capabilities. We prefer it to that of the smart village, wherein urban smart city practices are merely transposed, or the model of the smart city that leaks some smart practices at the margins to the surrounding countryside. The key questions here are, how does the ecosystem differ? What are the challenges? How is a smart region successfully integrated with the larger smart city concept? Helsinki Smart Region and the Smart Atlantic Way are the models to look at here. Across the specific areas of data collection, publication and reuse, we have some further brief insights. Data collection, to improve data collection, support local champions to establish and institutionalise the processes and practices of open data in rural administrations, with close relationships to urban open data groups. This may be the national portal, a nearby city portal, or an activist group. This could potentially be achieved by the development of training materials and incentives for local champions to participate in the training. This will also assist with improved digitisation and standardisation, both within the rural administration and across other related regions. And it's important also to highlight the value of the agricultural high-value data sets to the member states that have been identified as having a gap between their agricultural percentage of GDP and their open agricultural data sets. In terms of data opening, it's valuable to create collaborative links with complementary data owners, including not-for-profits, NGOs, researchers and private organisations that allow data to be opened and made available together. This could also be done via alternative models by which data can be shared when open licensing is not an option, for instance, as exemplified by the Join Data rural data sharing platform in the Netherlands. In terms of data reuse, we think it's important to establish links with urban areas via such instruments as hubs or universities with complementary interests. In France, the city of Brest and the rural centre of West Brittany area signed a mutual reciprocity contract in 2016. In the energy sector, the Brest-Brittany contract precipitated a new wood energy cluster, which aggregated waste from rural timber to feed a biomass incinerator in the city that fueled public lighting. The reciprocity contract has also increased healthcare collaboration, addressing Centre West Brittany's risk of becoming a medical desert. Data can help create the infrastructure necessary for shorter chains in food production, where the rural region supports local urban centres. Lastly, we suggest identifying and supporting a wider range of rural-specific challenges such as outmigration, health solutions that address distance, and food provenance. These can and should still be run in urban settings. Support might take form of assisting with the opening of key datasets or financial support. Thank you for watching and listening. To follow up on any of this, please contact me at j.c.walker@soton.ac.uk. Many thanks.